Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at Kamala Harris's polling and answering a very simple but also complicated question at the same time. Is the surge real? Is Kamala Harris legitimately doing that much better than Joe Biden? Is she legitimately beating Trump right now? And should we trust the polls this time around when they were wrong in 2020 and wrong in 2016? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about all of this. Kamala Harris right now in the 538 average leads by 2.7%. That this is a significant increase for Democrats from where they were just a month ago with Joe Biden as their nominee. Biden was losing in the polls by around 3 points in the days before he dropped out. And so we've seen, a 6 point shift roughly in favor of Kamala Harris from where where Democrats were a month ago with Joe Biden. And so a lot of people have kind of, seen this as predictable as, oh, look, Democrats finally, nominated someone who isn't 82 years old. Biden's approval rating was terrible. It was worse than Trump's. He'd been polling poorly for a while now. So it makes sense that when they replace him with a candidate who definitely not perfect, but broadly more popular, makes sense that when they replace him, they would start to pull better. And again, Kamala Harris isn't blowing Trump out of the water. She's only up by a little bit. And in 2020, a 3 point lead for Joe Biden by the end of the election would not be seen as a very good one. So keep that in mind. But on the other hand, there's people who are very skeptical of this, who are saying, look, no, the reason that we are seeing, such an increase in support for Kamala Harris isn't because she's doing that much better than Biden or because she's really winning. It's because Democrats are more energized and are likely to respond to the polls. So that's kind of the central focus of today's video is when you remember this topic, or this video even, remember this one thing. Non-response bias. So non-response bias is a thing that has been noticed by polls for years now. It is a trend in which members of a certain ideology or party, given, a certain point in time, are more or less likely to respond to a poll. If your party has and broadly thinking is that if your party has the momentum or is energized, or if you for some reason are very enthusiastic, you're likely to take the time to respond to a poll because you like to express your opinion. But if you don't like talking about politics, if you don't feel energized, maybe if you're even uncomfortable talking about your politics, you're not going to want to respond to a poll. And so that's why in 2016, a lot of people noticed in the polls after the election, there were a lot of gaps in Trump's support. And most of that came from what was described as the shy Trump voter effect, where a lot of people voted for Trump on election day, but didn't respond to polls. They didn't, in some cases, they didn't even tell polls they were going to vote for Trump because they were uncomfortable talking about their political opinion. So that is why you have to remember that these, polls often, things you don't even necessarily think of impact them. And so prior to the Biden dropout, Democrats were less energized than Republicans, and we saw this in voter registration data. We saw this in responses to the polls, where Republicans were more likely to respond to polls than Democrats were, and young Democrats, your young people broadly who lean left, were super unlikely to respond to polls. So that's why a lot of people, including myself, thought the polls were actually a little low on Joe Biden. Didn't mean I thought Biden was going to win or was even close to winning, but I thought he wasn't going to lose in a landslide. I thought he was going to lose in a normal loss, not a landslide. But now it's the other way around. And now a lot of people are asking the same question. Maybe Democrats are more energized and they're responding to polls at a higher rate than Republicans are, because right now Democrats have the momentum. That is what's interesting to me. So I've got a few pieces of evidence here. We're going to answer the question. But my answer, I'll say it up front, then I'll kind of reverse engineer it for you guys. I don't think that it's response bias. I don't. I think Kamala Harris legitimately is a better candidate than Joe Biden by a good amount. And I do legitimately think that her polling lead is to an extent real. Or at least as real as any other polling lead is. And polling leads, they're not infallible. Polls make mistakes, and this election we could very well see that. But based on what we know, I don't believe that this is a kind of manufactured lead for Harris. So let's talk about it. Again, you look at the more recent polls, Trump's actually seen some good signs for himself. Fox's national poll actually had him up by 1, which is very good for him. And then he was up by 2 in this RMG research poll. And again, RMG research, in the previous poll they did push undecideds, they had it even. So Trump gained 2 points in their weekly poll, which is a good sign for him. Again, 2 points in a week is usually statistical noise, so you have to consider that. But it's a good sign for him for sure. But other polls, it's bleak. Outward Intelligence, he's down by 6. He's down by 5 in Emerson, which was a poll that was very low on Democrats in 2022. ActiVote, he's down by 5. YouGov, he's down by 2. Morning Consult, down by 3. Big Village, down by 3 as well. Pew Research down by 1, Qantas down by 1, Morning Consult again down by 4, And then, we had some, other pollsters like Ipsos having him down by 5. Survey USA had him down by 3. Maris, which is a poll that I like, had him down by 3. So, Trump in the majority of polls is losing. And as you can see, if you compare it to where he was, let's say on August 1st, where he was, down by around a point, or even if you go to the end of July, it was basically a dead heat. He's now down by almost 3 points. So that is a concern for him. Now, we kind of have a few kind of case studies we can look at here. So the first is actually Joe Biden's approval rating. Now, you might be thinking, how does this necessarily relate to the polls? Now, if there was actually this increased bias in favor of Democrats responding, where Democrats are now more likely to respond than Republicans, you'd expect to see even a slight, just a slight uptick in Joe Biden's approval rating. So let's see. Today, he is down by 17.6% nationwide. He has a net negative 17.6 approval rating. But let's look at the day he dropped out. If we go to July 21st, excuse me. They don't have it, but on the day before, he was at 17.1. So he's actually gotten, slightly less unpopular since he dropped out. So if anything, I'm not saying this shows it, but if there was a response bias that was affecting Biden's approval rating, it would be from Republicans, not Democrats, because he's actually gotten half a point less popular nationally. So that's, to me, not any indication that Kamala Harris is benefiting from a boost among Democrats responding to the polls. This just shows that the polls, at least in terms of Biden approval, the same polls they're doing nationally, the margins, they're doing nationally, the margins, they, again, still show Biden being super unpopular and as unpopular as he was the day he dropped out. So that kind of passes the smell test. But let's look at Kamala Harris's, favorable rating. She doesn't have an approval rating since she's not the president, but we do have a favorable rating, which I think is somewhat comparable. And again, if you look at the day Joe Biden dropped out, let's go July 20th. She was negative 16. So she was not popular either. She was only a point and a half less unpopular or more popular than Joe Biden was. She's now down by 3.5. So that shows when you compare these, it's apples to oranges, but at the very least, it's a pretty close orange to a pretty close apple, right? This is the closest comparison we're going to get. We can see Biden stays the same, but Harris gains 13 points. So in these polls, Biden stays the same, Democrats broadly stay the same. It's Kamala Harris herself who's doing the improvement. It's not that the polls are changing, it's that Harris herself does the improvement. But now let's talk about Senate races, because these are the only other federal elections that are held statewide. So let's look at them. Now, to be fair, this is a tweet that was inspired by Joel Wertheimer, who actually kind of, asked himself this question, and he asked, quote, in a continuing series, is this response bias or is it real? This tweet's from 2 days ago. He says, Bob Casey, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania up for re-election, his polling average is up just 1 point since Biden dropped out. Harris's numbers are 4.4% closer to Casey than Biden was. So the polls, his verdict at least, mostly real. Now, again, obviously, this person is a Democrat. It says here in his bio that he is a former Obama Associate Staff Secretary. So we know, obviously, he's probably going to be voting for Kamala Harris in November and, potentially if he lives in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey. But this is good data here, right? Like when you take a look at the, these polls and you compare them to what they were prior to the dropout, Joe Biden's margins were bad. Bob Casey's, they were bad while Bob Casey's numbers were good. Bob Casey's numbers stay good, but Harris's numbers got better. Again, if the electorate that the polls were surveying got bluer because of response bias, we would have all seen Casey tick up, right? Because if you're surveying more Democrats, maybe Casey sure gets 3, 4, 5 points more Democratic. That didn't happen. And so we do know that if the composition of the polls is roughly the same here, Casey's only gained about a point, maybe you don't expect Harris to gain a point, but instead, she's up by more than 4.4%. Compared to Bob Casey, as comparison to Joe, relative to Bob Casey as compared to Joe Biden, excuse me. So we know in Pennsylvania specifically, the polls haven't changed, but Kamala Harris has changed relative to Joe Biden. So let's now look at Arizona, which is another Senate race I'm very interested in. I'll be making a video on soon because I've got a lot of suggestions. I did not know people were so interested in the Senate race, so I'm happy to cover it. I'll probably cover it for the next few days. Arizona, we got a GOP poll showing it tied, but aside from that, it's been very good for Ruben Gallego. He's up by 11 in High Ground. He's up by 6 in Redfield and Wilton. He's up by 9 in the Cook Political Report sponsored poll. This is the primary poll. My eyes burst out of my sockets for a second. Emerson has him up by 4. PPP Democratic poll has him up by 7. He's up by 3 in this other Democratic poll. Kari Lake's internal has her up by 1. This GOP poll has it tied. And then you go back to June. It's still pretty good for Gallego. He's up by 1 here. Could be better. but he was up by more in Emerson. GOP, this is Trump's pollster. He's up by 3. He's up by 8 in FAU, and he's up by 13 in YouGov. So the polls have roughly stayed the same for Gallego. They've, been pretty good for him all across the board. And Kamala Harris has surged in Arizona. Biden was down 5-6 points. If we look at the presidential polls in Arizona, I can tell you right now, Kamala Harris has a lead there. So the Senate polls haven't changed, but the presidential polls have. And that, I've given you 2 examples now, Pennsylvania and Arizona. And I've also talked about that approval rating boost. So that's where I am right now. I think that this is mostly real. Again, I wouldn't be shocked if we have movement towards Trump before Election Day, but I think right now, based on what we know, these polls are real. It's not response bias. It could be a little bit. I think Democrats are now a bit more likely to respond, so it could be 5% of it. But really, the other 95% of this movement, I truly believe, is because Kamala Harris is a better candidate than Joe Biden is, and because the race right now is closer. So let me know what you think below. Again, feel free to comment down video suggestions, and I'll see you all in the next one.